IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Over the last couple of weeks, you might have all noticed that we've been talking a lot about the fact that we're heading towards what appears to be a bipolar world dominated by the US and China. Today, we're going to talk about the bipolarity of our world in a different kind of way, not about the US and China, but instead about the North and South poles. Aditya has recently gotten a chapter published in a book by Springer Publications about India's Arctic policy. And over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about what's happening in the North and South poles in terms of geopolitical rivalry, why the poles are important to us at all, and what India needs to be doing about them. So welcome, Aditya.
Thank you.
Let's bring our listeners up to speed first. What the hell is going on in the poles? One keeps hearing news about Russia starting new icebreakers. Every now and then there's news of this and that iceberg collapsing. There's news of massive oil spills and all kinds of stuff happening. But what really is the situation in terms of geopolitical rivalry? What kind of resources are countries competing for in the Arctic? And where do you see it going in the next couple of decades as climate change accelerates?
Sure. You broadly have two ongoing narratives about the Arctic. One is that as the climate heats up, the region is being opened up for mineral exploitation. The other is, of course, that along with this new scramble for resources, you also have countries of the Arctic and around the Arctic competing with each other. So you have this geopolitical competition. There's some truth to both of these narratives, but I think there are some serious caveats to them as well. Yes, it's true that the Arctic is absolutely changing. There is actually fairly catastrophic change in the Arctic. Just the last two summers have been so bad in the Arctic that in September or October, you've had fairly ice-free conditions. This is not a normal thing to happen in the Arctic. You've also had massive forest fires in Siberia and Alaska last year. And these forest fires were actually so bad that they sent out these plumes of black soot into the upper atmosphere. They could be seen from space. You've had unprecedented temperatures. Temperatures last year were something like 10 degrees higher than the average from about 1979 to 2010. So something clearly very dramatic is happening in the Arctic, and we should all be very concerned about it. The other huge concern with the Arctic, of course, is that glacial ice is melting. And while a lot of us look at how much of the Arctic Ocean is covered by ice, what really matters most to the world's environment is how much of that glacial ice is melting. And when that glacial ice melts, it's going to introduce so much fresh water into the world's oceans. It's going to change temperature, salinity, and that's not just going to affect the Arctic Ocean. It's really going to have knock-on effects for all of us. We should be under no illusions that all of us will be affected by it. Having said that, just because there's an environmental catastrophe unfolding in the Arctic, it doesn't mean that the region is ripe for mineral resource exploitation. Remember, as the region goes through these tumultuous changes, it also means that the weather is going to be unpredictable. It also means that the environment is going to be very difficult to operate in. For example, right now, you might think that Russians would be celebrating that the permafrost, the permanent ice in the Arctic is melting. What's happening as a lot of this permafrost melts is that a lot of that infrastructure, which is built on that permafrost, is in trouble. It's literally sinking into the ground below. So, climate change in the Arctic is for the next 10 or 20 years actually going to be bad for business. If you have squalls and storms, the unpredictable climate, if you have the ice literally giving away beneath infrastructure, it's going to be very difficult to plan. It's going to be very difficult to insure. It's going to be very difficult to build sustainably in the region. So let's not imagine that the Arctic is going to be an easy environment to work in. Even today, the cost of extracting oil from the Arctic is much higher than extracting oil from elsewhere. And if you look at what oil prices are like today, it's not hard to imagine that it's going to be very difficult to find market justification for new oil projects in the region. And of course, the second narrative is that, the countries of the Arctic are about to clash, or that there's this huge new military competition. So I would say yes and no to that. if you compare current military competition to what went on during the Cold War, it's still pretty good. It's just nowhere as bad today as it was in, say, 1960. We don't have the kind of nuclear tensions that we had in that period. A lot of the military infrastructure that's being built in the Arctic today is actually for commercial purposes. If you, for example, have a lot of search and rescue facilities in these shipping routes, it helps reduce insurance costs and it makes these shipping routes more attractive. So, let's not overplay what this geopolitical competition means. The other associated factor here is, of course, the shipping routes. There are broadly two usable shipping routes through the Arctic. One is the Northern Supply Route, which is the one that hugs the Russian coast. The other is the Northwest Passage that goes along Canada. The Russian route is actually the one that has the best infrastructure, in which most commercial shipping plies. The Canadian route is one where the infrastructure is still in a nascent stage. It's still being built, but the Canadians are committed to developing it. There is technically a third route, so-called Transpolar Route, which means you basically go right through the middle of the Arctic Ocean. That route is still not a feasible one as of now, but it may become feasible in the second half of this century.
Okay, Aditya, so fair enough. Yes, a lot of countries around the Arctic are getting involved with potentially trying to take advantage of new shipping routes. And as you pointed out correctly, there are pretty serious ramifications for the global climate crisis, which strangely enough, Arctic countries don't seem to be too interested in doing. But let's try to kind of come back and center ourselves in India once again, right? How does all this matter to India? Of course, as you said, climate change is an issue that is going to affect all of us. It's something that's already affecting a lot of Indians, especially deep inland, because it's a complex process that's connected to many, many different aspects of our global environment. A change in salinity levels is going to change the livelihoods of fishermen all across the subcontinent seaboard, which is going to have ramifications on food security further inland. It's also going to impact rain systems and so on and so forth. It's so clearly, I would assume that India's biggest interest in the Arctic is trying to make sure that climate change doesn't happen at the rate that it's happening at right now. But even beyond that, if you look at the geopolitics of it, is there a way to balance the national interest imperative of decelerating climate change with the economic opportunities that might be had by investing in opportunities in the poles?
That's a very interesting question, Anirudh. And I think that's a question that India's policymakers are still grappling with. The key question there is, what is the size of the economic opportunity and how viable is it? And I think that is something that is still unclear, despite this narrative about Arctic being suddenly opened up for business and the scramble for resources. I think the degree to which such a scramble might occur is still something quite uncertain. And I think that for a country like India, which has fairly limited resources, it's not clear what India can do in the Arctic. It's also, I think, important to point out that for India, India doesn't just look at the Arctic, but India conceives of it as a broader region, which includes northeastern Siberia, for example. So a lot of these places are rich in oil resources, and India has expressed interest in participating in a lot of these projects. So I think for India, there is a broader region in the northern latitudes where it does see opportunities in the future for mineral resource extraction. However, I don't see India being at the forefront of some drive to strip the Arctic of all its resources. India is friends with every single Arctic country. And one of India's challenges is actually to balance the friendships it has with, for example, both the United States and Russia.
Aditya, hang on. So you said that India is friends with most nations that border the Arctic, right? So I assume that hasn't exactly come out of nowhere. Clearly, there's a history of Indian engagement with the Arctic and I think even more broadly the Antarctic, of which we're just seeing the tip of the metaphorical iceberg here. So we'll come back to the national interest implications of this climate change in a little while. But let's talk a little bit about India's polar diplomacy. What has India been doing at the poles? Potentially, what are the levers that India might be able to use? What do you think we might be able to convince polar countries to do to advance Indian interests?
Sure. India's engagement with polar regions and including the Arctic is actually not something all that new. There have been a few bursts of activity that have actually defined India's engagement with both the Antarctic and the Arctic. And in a sense, India's legal connection to the Arctic really dates back to the 1923 Svalbard Treaty, which is basically a treaty to share the island of Svalbard in Norway which is basically a treaty that gave contracting parties access to the island of Svalbard in Norway for scientific and commercial purposes. But really, after 1923, the Arctic, let's just say, went on the back burner for India. And what India really did was to look south towards the Antarctic. And the first burst of such Arctic-related diplomacy came in the early 50s. Just for context, this is the time of the Cold War. And India was really concerned that we were going to see a scramble for resources in the Antarctic. And that the superpower rivalries would play out there, that they would start maybe even stationing atomic weapons there. And so in 1956, India's permanent representative to the UN actually submitted a memorandum to the UN General Assembly in February of 56, calling for a discussion on the Antarctic in the Assembly's provisional agenda. And what the permanent representative, Arthur Lal, basically warned was that the development of rapid communication, as he called it, would make the extraction of mineral resources much easier, and that this would accentuate world tensions. Now, what happened after that was that India didn't quite anticipate the reaction that it got from some other countries. There are a lot of claimants to the Antarctic, unlike with the Arctic. And two of those claimants, Chile and Argentina, actually reacted strongly to this Indian intervention. And India actually had to go out and try and explain to them that, although there are no populations in the Antarctic, India is just concerned about the possibility of it being, as the MEA called it, a field for international war, which in the atomic age would be disastrous, unquote. And, so I think that this attempt by India to play Antarctic politics didn't quite work out because, there was resistance from countries that had claims in the Antarctic and didn't want another country butting in. And having said that, India's intervention, I think, did have an impact because when the Antarctic Treaty was signed a few years later, it did include, for example, a provision of making the Antarctic free of atomic weapons. And I think that is something that India really definitely wanted. So, I wouldn't say that the 1950s, that India's 1950s intervention was a complete washout. It did have some sort of impact. The more substantial intervention that came in the early 80s. And, this is one of those things that have been lost in India's diplomatic history. It's a combination of both an expedition and diplomatic maneuvering. So in 1981, the Indian government actually started making these fairly secretive preparations for an Arctic expedition. They very discreetly went and leased this Polar-class submarine from the Norwegians. And in 1982, a 21-member crew of scientists and Navy personnel reached Queen Maud Land in the Antarctic. And this was, again, a region claimed by Norway. So, there's a deep connection between India and Norway when it comes to polar diplomacy. And, this expedition, now once it reached the Antarctic, it became public and, it got a lot of attention worldwide. What are the Indians doing in the Antarctic? And then India sent a second expedition later that year and eventually a third, and it's set up its first permanent base, what was then called Dakshin Gangotri. That base no longer exists. India has two other bases now, but, this was a clear indication that India wanted to have a permanent presence in the Antarctic. And by having this substantial scientific presence in the region, India became eligible for and received this so-called consultative status under the Antarctic Treaty. So, the early 80s represent a fairly interesting attempt at polar diplomacy by India and a successful one. India still continues to invest deeply in the Antarctic. India is concerned about the impact of environmental degradation in the Antarctic on India. The Antarctic is very much linked to the Indian Ocean weather system. So Indian scientists are very committed to seeing how ocean currents and sea wildlife interact between these two seas.
Oh God, I can just imagine that if the Antarctic continues to melt at the rate that it is, a change in the Indian Ocean monsoon would impoverish and lead to droughts across possibly one of the densest populated regions in the world. And leave aside a broader kind of like geopolitical or diplomatic policy for these regions, I'm not sure the government currently has a plan to deal with the scale of the droughts that might be coming unless we manage to slow down climate change appreciably.
Yeah, I don't see what we can do actually. the Antarctic is a region that Indian scientists have been really very deeply concerned about for a long time. And it's also fairly clear that for Indira Gandhi, who launched this expedition in 1981, 82, 83, the environmental concerns were absolutely paramount. I don't think that by then India had any huge ambitions for exploiting mineral resources in the Antarctic. It was very much about the environment. And I think that was a very far-reaching move because India still has 2 stations in that continent, and they are actually its biggest polar presence even today.
Fair enough. Point well made, Aditya. So let's come back to the Arctic, Aditya. Now, you made a point that what India's exact policy is in the region should depend on the size of the economic opportunity. But I'd actually like to contest that, because even if we could, it honestly doesn't make a difference if India can make millions or billions from exploiting resources in the Arctic, when, for example, a change in the Antarctic and the change in the Indian Ocean's weather patterns reach a point where Indians don't even have access to water anymore. It's not like any amount of resources in these regions are going to lead to such an enormous windfall that Indians are suddenly going to be able to afford air conditioning and be able to afford water desalination plants and all that. So it's kind of difficult for me to understand what precisely an Indian polar policy would look like, unless that policy is purely about perhaps to some extent power projection, to some extent perhaps resource extraction, but primarily about working with the rest of the world to kind of preserve the ice caps as they are and make sure that they do not melt at the rate that they're melting. What are your thoughts on the matter?
What you just said, is reflective of debates that were going on in India in the late 2000s and early 2010s as well. You had people on the one hand who at that time really believed that India should join this supposed scramble for resources, which never really took off. And you have others who were absolutely alarmed by what was going on and really just wanted India to try and push for some sort of freeze on commercial activity in the Arctic. I think that Indian policy since then has moved from these sort of maximalist tendencies towards something more modest. The late 2000s were a time when there was a widespread belief, not just in India, but in other countries, that the Arctic was, just about to melt and it's just going to become this, sunny beach resort all of a sudden, and everybody's going to start building oil wells everywhere. That never happened, but I think it really did influence the debate in India. 2013, India made a successful application for joining the Arctic Council, which is an 8-member body of Arctic region countries. And India and China joined the Arctic Council as observers that year. As observers, they don't really get to say much, but I think India really wanted to be there where the decisions are made to understand what is going on. India is a country that's very determined to be in any forum where important decisions are being made. I think India's pursuit of an Arctic Council membership is very emblematic of that. As far as what India's interests in the region were, in 2013, the Ministry of External Affairs put out a roughly 1,000-word briefing on the subject. And it basically defined India's interests in the region as being, quote, scientific, environmental, commercial, as well as strategic, unquote. And, this is a very broad-based definition. And the sort of expansive understanding of India's interests is basically meant to keep the country's options open. Because I think it reflects India's contradictory impulses. On the one hand, India is very genuinely concerned about the environmental impact on the Arctic, but it also didn't want to be left out of any rush for resources in the region. India was also concerned about China's own ambitions in the Arctic and what that might mean for India. I think that since then, we've seen a maturing of the debate in India. I don't think that Indians believe they can fundamentally change Arctic politics. The Arctic, by the way, is very fundamentally different from the Antarctic. And Indians have taken their understanding of the Antarctic and tried to impose it on the Arctic, and it just doesn't work. For instance, Indians call for a nuclear-free Arctic. Now, that is just not going to happen. Remember, the Arctic is basically an ocean surrounded by land, whereas the Antarctic is a continent of land surrounded by ocean. The Arctic is inhabited by human beings. All of those countries there have indigenous populations who have traditionally lived off the land and the water in the Arctic. You can't call, for example, for a nuclear-free Arctic because both American and Russian ballistic missile nuclear submarines patrol those waters, and they're not going to stop doing that just because you tell them to. India cannot say, let's have a moratorium on commercial interests, because those commercial interests are absolutely important for a lot of these countries, especially Russia and Canada. India cannot call for internationalization of the Arctic's waters, because those are already surrounded by existing legal regimes like the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So I think that it's very difficult for India to go and make some fundamental changes in the Arctic. What India can do is counsel restraint, to work only on responsible projects that are likely to have minimal environmental impact. What India can do is continue to invest scientific resources in researching in the Arctic. India does have collaborations with, for example, Norway once again. It should also expand such research collaborations with Russia and Canada, basically in order to understand the changes that are going on in the Arctic and what that might mean for India. This is a field which Indian researchers have already begun working in, starting in the late 2000s, but I think it's something that really needs to be expanded in the coming years. The final, I think, critical factor for India is to understand that the Arctic is very much part of geopolitics today. And while the Arctic may be on the periphery of India's geopolitical concerns, it is a significant factor, and India will need to monitor the region. So, for example, China has these great ambitions in the Arctic. In 2012, it fashioned itself as this so-called near-Arctic state. Now, that's a geographically nonsensical claim. But the fact that the Chinese make it, I think, gives us a sense of how large their ambitions are in the region. Having said that, Chinese ambitions in the Arctic rely on Russia. And the cooperation between those two countries has been interesting to watch. While the Russians have cooperated in helping the Chinese expand their footprint in the Arctic, they're also very wary of the Chinese. I don't think they have any illusions about what China's ambitions really are and what it might mean for Russia's own sovereignty. So I think those are the things we really need to look out for, because, for example, the Russia-China relationship is really important to India. Similarly, if China were to make further forays into the Arctic, it's going to affect America's own maritime calculations. It's going to affect relations between Canada and China. Any American claims to the Northwest Passage could affect relations between the US and Canada. So I think these are all things that India needs to develop the expertise in monitoring and understanding, and to think of the subtle ways in which those might affect geopolitics. So, in a sense, just like we're building scientific capacity to understand the ecological impact of changes in the Arctic, in the Indian Ocean region, I think we should also develop the geopolitical expertise to understand how the politics of that region could affect India.
All right, so thank you, Aditya. And I think you made two very interesting points which I'd like to just highlight here once again. The first is that India, while it has a fairly scientific approach to its policy in the Arctic regions, at the same time, it isn't necessarily realistic in terms of taking on board the concerns of other countries who are interested in the Arctic, who very clearly see the opportunity in fundamentally different ways from India. So it's going to take a lot of very measured diplomacy, in addition to difficult policy work here at home itself, to kind of prepare for the challenges that climate change in these regions are going to bring us. On that note, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. So, a great week of shows behind us, and hope that you've been catching up on as much of it as you can. We had Abhishek Bachchan on Football Shitball. Yeah, let me say that again. Abhishek Bachchan was on Football Shitball. Did I mention Abhishek Bachchan was on Football Shitball? That was a fun episode. You should definitely check that out. Really, really deep conversation about cricket and things like that. We had Vikram Kochar on Cyrus Says, talking about the platforms and stuff like what's going on over there. On the note, Maruk had spoken to Sanjay Jha, which was again a really, really interesting conversation. On Edges and Sledges, the guys are having an interesting conversation about, well, what are our favorite formats of cricket and things like that. So it's just really been a really, really awesome week on the network, and please do check things out. And with that, hope to see you next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.